what do you think? Should we get started? Yeah, sure. So we may have some other folks joining us, but it's a couple of minutes past 8, so I think we should get started. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Gerald Russello, the editor of the University Bookman. Thanks very much to all of you, both new faces and old friends, for joining us today. And thanks also to our co-hosts, which are, in addition to the University Bookman and the Russell Kirk Center, the New Criterion, First Things, and the publisher of Stephen's new book, Cluny Media. And we're very happy that Stephen was able to take the time to talk to us about his book. Among other things, once you'll find, if you haven't yet seen this book, is that it really is the perfect Christmas or other holiday gift for people who like to read fun, thoughtful essays about interesting people. And I can't really highly recommend it enough. And in his own life, Stephen continues the tradition of the literary life that he reflects in the subjects in his book. He is, as some of you may know, a man of finance, not necessarily directly or full-time of literature, commuting to Manhattan before the pandemic from Connecticut, where he lives with his lovely wife and children, but who spends the commute and other odd hours in exploring and excavating lesser-known corners of literary history, which is what is compiled in this book. And I think that we're in for a treat in many respects, including those of us who have studied Russell Kirk for a long time, even a connection or two with Kirk and some of the subjects of Stephen's book. And so Stephen will give his talk, and if you have any questions or commentary, you can either email it to me or you can put it in the chat box at the bottom, and we'll try and get to as many as we can after his commentary. But while he is speaking, if you remember, please hit your mute button so there's no crosstalk that interrupts Stephen. And with that, I'll let Stephen go ahead.
Except Beatrice. Beatrice is allowed to make all the noise that she wants.
Yeah, she can say whatever she likes.
So sweet. Well, the only problem, I guess, with writing a book about delightful people is the unrealistic expectations it sets for me. But I'm blessed. Gerald is a delightful host, the great Gerald Russello. He's right. Until the coronavirus, Gerald and I were daily commuters by train into Manhattan, and it gave me the time to write the book. But I'd say also Gerald's enormous editorial and literary output on top of his demanding day job gave me a ton of encouragement and inspiration. It's really a marvel. And the work he does with the University Bookman and supported by the Russell Kirk Center, it's very special. We'll get back to Russell Kirk later, I hope. I also thank, First Things, the New Criterion, and the publisher Cluny Media, very helpful throughout many of the pieces that ran at their publication and co-hosting tonight. You should subscribe, buy a subscription for a college student to all of them, support all of them. Gerald's right, I think the book makes an excellent Christmas gift. And if you don't like mine, Cluny has a bunch of other great books that are worthy of your support. And I think he's on the call. I'm also grateful for John Clark, who supported it, the publisher. You should all learn more about Cluny and John's great creative work there. And then I also saw the name, my introducer in the book the introduction was supplied by Father Austin Litke. Key passages in the book were inspired and I'd say refined by long walks together in Rome. And in the book, you'll discover especially Willa Cather's admiration for his Dominican friars, and especially her love for Rome, which I didn't really understand until I started pulling on some threads in her life and reading some of her letters, which are just as charming and amusing as all of her novels. So we can dig into the book. I'll try to introduce maybe a few of the characters, but I also, in gratitude for the Kirk Center, I think I want to try to tie it back to some of what Russell Kirk was up to, and then we can do some questions. So as I introduce the book, when the Blessed Virgin saw the wine failing at Cana, she introduced the servants to our Lord, and he blessed the water into wine, we know that. He made the wedding feast more effervescent. And so each of us, many of you on the call, or I would count among these people, you know a delightful person whose presence is effervescence at any party. And tonight, and in the little book, I hope to introduce you to several more delightful people. I'll start maybe with a quick aside. On the matter of wine and effervescence, I have a friend whose French grandmother, she's a mother of 11, she demanded once a spoon of champagne on her deathbed from the priest who was giving her last rites. And she explained to him, as a French grandmother should explain to a young priest, that everyone deserves a teaspoon of champagne at their birth, a teaspoon at death, and as she recommends, a great deal in between. So buy the book, buy some champagne. When you, I didn't realize this until I started having a book available on Amazon. It will show you the things people buy with your book. And maybe someone on the call is the person who bought a champagne saber along with my book. So I thought that was really special and beautiful, and hope someone enjoys that as much as they enjoy the book. Maybe turning to the people you meet in the book, I hope all of you know Willa Cather. If you don't, go buy every single book she's ever written and read them all this winter. It's a great quarantine stack to work through. And I hope you get to know her friend, the writer Sarah Orne Jewett. Cather ranked her book, The Country of the Pointed Firs. This is really high praise. She ranked it alongside Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter and Twain's Tom Sawyer. She thought they were the three great American classics. So go read it. It's a great book. Maybe save it for the spring if you're dreaming about the coast in Maine. And then in the book, you'll also meet Cather's long forgotten editor. She's a really special person that I came across. Her name was Viola Roseborough. She was a sort of female Dr. Johnson in her day. She spent most of her career editing geniuses like Cather and O. Henry and Jack London. So we don't have much left from her, but we do know that she was her own woman. She was an independent working woman in New York, but she viciously opposed the suffragettes. She had no time for them. She thought they were silly and filled with enthusiasm. And then you'll meet the artist that Cather and Roseborough both admired, the painter and stained glass maker John La Farge, who went to Professor Josh's college at Mount St. Mary's in Emmitsburg, which is a wonderful place. Also, when the pandemic ends, you should go hike up the mount. It's a really beautiful place. I've been there many summers. And in the morning, La Farge would walk along the cliffs in the mansions at Newport. He would wear a purple kimono, and he would just muse on the water spraying up on the cliffs. And he beat Louis Tiffany, to the patent office. He beat him with his stained glass. And then his New York studio hosted Frederick Bartholdi as he designed the Statue of Liberty. There were just many people he supported. As men were drawn into the military, he welcomed some of the first women to work in his studio as artisans. And what I came to discover, maybe some folks knew this already, but to me it was a delight. It was La Farge who accompanied Henry Adams to the South Pacific and then on to France, where Adams made his most famous and wonderful journey from Mont Saint-Michel to Chartres. And it was really La Farge who gave Adams a crash course in stained glass and was responsible for so much of that wonderful work that still inspires pilgrims to go there. Gerald and I, we've both been to Chauncey Stillman's Wethersfield estate, this enormous estate in Dutchess County, New York. Most of it is protected farmland. And John La Farge's grandson was named after Henry Adams, called Henry Adams La Farge. It's quite a name. And Henry Adams La Farge remembered being kept awake at night while Chauncey's two white peacocks would scream. They would scream atop the garden walls and keep all the guests awake. Chauncey, I think, could sleep through it. Or maybe Doug could share. He was maybe protected in his back bedroom that was insulated. But I thought that was something special I learned during the writing of the book. When Adams went to Chartres, he developed this very special appreciation for the Blessed Virgin and really rediscovered a lot of that medieval cult around her. And there was a copy of his Prayer to the Virgin that was discovered after Adams died. It was his niece. She was also La Farge's daughter-in-law, Mabel Hooper La Farge. And Mabel left us the only biography that we have of this guy named Egisto Fabbri. He was the son of one of J.P. Morgan's early partners. He was the first collector of Cézanne. He was a charming Italian dandy, and he was educated at St. Paul's in America and then followed Dante back to the golden light of Italy. and the faith of his fathers. And he reemerged in Italy and led the traditional patriarchal life. The whole household gathered around him, and he was very generous in lots of quiet ways. And when La Farge's son declared his intention to join the Jesuits, the artist was concerned, confused, worried. La Farge had a lot of children. He liked noisy family life. And so he withheld his approval until Teddy Roosevelt told John to man up and agree to young John's request. So we're grateful for that. I think that's a great classic, a great autobiography in American history is John La Farge's, Father John's autobiography that I think many people here maybe have heard about or should pick up and read. And the La Farges, the Roosevelts, the Adamses, they were all brought together, and this was a great couple I discovered here. They were all brought together by Mr. and Mrs. Winthrop Chanler. They were society types. They actually made the list of the 400 members of New York society that Ward McAllister threw together. And Henry James, I mean, this is praise from Caesar. Henry James judged Daisy the most cultivated woman in America. And her husband, Winthrop, or Winty, he was one of the famous Astor orphans. He was a Rough Rider with Teddy Roosevelt. He didn't really have a job. He was just sort of a wandering adventurer. And in Cuba with Teddy and the Rough Riders, he was shot in the arm. It wasn't a major injury, so he went back. He stayed at Stanford White's house in New York, and he rehabbed himself. He would lift weights, and he would drink champagne. And I think that's a great training regimen that I appreciate now that I don't have to play competitive sports. And Daisy grew up in Rome. She grew up ducking in and out of Roman garden hedges with Edith Wharton, who lived for a time in Rome as a child. And when Daisy converted to the Catholic Church, she found that her new religion made life a bit difficult. The Chanlers had this crumbling old family estate on the Hudson, and some of her sisters-in-law were very confused about this Roman influence on the family. So she settled further upstate, which was a great relief to her husband, who could run fox hunting up there. And she could freely entertain Monsignor Cyril Sigourney Fay. And it's a shame we only have about 3 pictures of him. He was enormously obese. He was an albino priest and an early mentor to F. Scott Fitzgerald. You can pick up a few bits of Father Fay and Daisy in a couple different spots throughout Fitzgerald's work. Not much is left of him, but quite a character. And to Daisy's party list, you could add Henry James. In the book, I focus less maybe on a lot of his novels. Really, I spend a bit of time with his first novel and on his time in Rome. So try to linger on his time in Rome during the era of the Papal States. This is a lost world. This is before Garibaldi breaches the wall at Porta Pia. That shut the door to the 8th century. I mean, it's hard to recapture some of that. Some people might like to now. But this is before the full color, before the full ceremony and ritual of Rome were drained away by supposedly modern civilization. And it just leaches away. This was the era, James really sets the stage quite nicely. This was the era when malarial air clings to the Colosseum. The papal household is served by the princely families of Rome. There's a character I didn't get to in the book, maybe in a follow-on book we'll have to get to him. But among the papal chamberlains, the men who served in the papal household, there was one American, Francis McNutt. His autobiography is about 500 pages of nothing but name dropping. It's spectacular, and Henry Adams hated him. He was not trusting him. He was maybe more in allegiance to Rome than to America, and he ran into McNutt all around Europe. McNutt was sort of a handler and a schmoozer of empresses and emperors, and always maneuvering. So Adams was always right back in frantic communiques to Teddy Roosevelt. I saw McNutt again. I had a fit of apoplexy. I can't stand him. And Teddy would calm him down. And so if we pull it back to maybe a parlor scene in New York. Try to imagine Henry James, big personality, stuttering through lunch. Daisy Chanler, maybe trying to impress James, prove how smart and erudite she is. And then you have seated next to them, Daisy's brother. He's a special guy. Daisy's brother is a prolific novelist. He outsold James in many ways early in their career. It was Frances Marion Crawford. And Marion wandered all over. He lived the sort of expat life that Daisy led. He lived in America, he went to England and Germany. He did a lot of dueling in Germany, drank a lot of beer, got a job as a kind of hack journalist in India, and then settled back in Rome and kept his writer's studio on Villa Crawford, which is on the cliffs of Sorrento. Willa Cather met him. So this is what's so powerful. I said, as folks were joining, I think Henry Adams knew everyone alive at this time. But it is, I think what was so charming about writing the book was just discovering how many of these people met each other, knew each other, judged each other. So Willa Cather met Crawford once and judged him a detestable snob. And then Lady Randolph Spencer Churchill met him, and she thought, well, no, he's the sort of very best type of a good-looking American. And Crawford flirted with Isabella Stewart Gardner. He had a friendship, maybe a brief courtship with Lily Conrad. This is one of those minor characters who just, there's a drop of her left on the pages of history, but this beautiful young woman, Lily Conrad, she was judged in her day the most beautiful woman in Rome. I mean, what a thing to be known as. And Conrad would spark very dangerous infatuations. There was a young son of a Roman princely family. He tried to woo her. He failed. Very dramatic, very romantic. He shot himself before her portrait in a gallery on the Corso. And then in India, if we keep following Crawford a little bit, Crawford met another character who just drops into history. This mysterious Mr. Alexander Jacobs. He was supposedly the former slave of an Ottoman pasha. He became a diamond merchant, and he brokered the sale of the 19th century's most famous gemstone, something called the imperial diamond, 180 carats. And Crawford met him, got to know him, and basically did what I did. He said, well, this is someone I've encountered. I should write about him. I should just steal his life. And so he wrote his first novel about him. And he has this great line. My wife said, don't get canceled. So hopefully no Persians will be offended. Crawford said, Jacobs was a Persian. All Persians have business instincts. And the popular saying for me is 9 Greeks to cheat an Armenian, but 9 Armenians to cheat a Persian. So Crawford's uncle insisted he write a novel about this. It became a bestseller. We think it's the first American novel that was set in India. And from there, his career took off. He was hungry for material. Gerald and I have to look out the windows of the Metro North train. Crawford could find it all outside the walls of his writer's studio. He went through the wilder districts of Italy with a mule. The peasants taught him winemaking. He learned Bohemian in Prague and other, 17 languages or so he learned. Silversmithing, Venetian glassmaking. And he was his own architect at Villa Crawford in Sorrento. The house is built on the cliffs. And so he would design his own brickwork. He would tally the need for the buttresses in his head, design improvements to the seawall. We live on a little old farmhouse in backcountry Connecticut. We have a little stone wall. I filled a 12-foot gap about 3 feet high, and I was done for a month. I don't know how he could have possibly built reservoirs. So he built reservoirs that could hold 12 months supply of fresh water. Apparently an old Italian trick was to fill your reservoir with live eels, and that would sweeten the water. Must be an acquired Italian taste. And then to pay for his butler, for his footmen, for his servants, for the yacht with the well-dressed sailors, he wrote 5,000 words a day. And when he needed solitude to finish the books, he would, a beautiful house on the cliffs of Sorrento wasn't enough. There were too many fun people around. He would retreat to this thing he called the Tower at San Nicola. It was this old bulwark, abandoned bulwark against invading Saracens on the coast of Calabria. He would shut himself up there. They would rope up food to him, just some bread and wine, and keep him going while he really had to make enough money to keep the family going. All that worked. He made a lot of money. His books were bestsellers. This made Henry James green with envy. He was just sickened by Crawford's superior commercial success. He judged it inferior fiction. Crawford actually was very humble, and he admitted that was probably true. But still, at the turn of the century, there was enough demand for his publisher to republish his completed works. I mean, a 32-volume hardcover set came out. I think they did 2 editions of that. John, maybe Cluny Media, we could find a few worth printing. There's a trilogy called the Saracinesca trilogy. He wrote a book called Corleone, which we believe is an early proto-Godfather story, one of the first stories, maybe the first story about the Cosa Nostra or the mafia. And then a bunch of other ghost stories, and we'll maybe get back to them in a little bit. So again, sorry, I'm digressing. Get back to the parlor scene. James, Daisy Chanler, Crawford, they're having lunch, and Crawford starts teasing Henry James. He says, I can tell the exact year when you started dictating your novels. And then Daisy, I think, was a little eager to impress James. She comes to his defense and she says, well, Marion, I know that you dictated your 2-volume history of Rome. And it kind of lingers there and dies, and they move on to something else. But Russell Kirk loved that book, this 2-volume history of Rome. It was the book he carried with him whenever he went to Rome. Crawford's best novels, and this history also contains some of it, they're both art and artifact. I mean, he really lived in the last echoes of the era when you could still imagine Viva Garibaldi, Viva Pio Nono running through the streets in rivalry in Rome. I mean, it seems like 1,000 years ago. This is maybe just a taste of Crawford's style. It's from that book that Kirk loved. This is, it describes, one of his daily walks that he took in Rome, but enough of it was still the same that you could feel it while Crawford was a young man. So here, just a quote. Among the old-time gardens and the avenues of lordly cypresses and of bitter orange trees and the moss-grown fountains and the long walks fragrant with half-wild roses and sweet flowers that no one thinks of planting now. Beyond, a wild waste of field and broken land led up to Santa Maria Maggiore, and the grand old bells sent their far voices ringing in deep harmony to our windows. And so this was the culture, this was the Rome that created Frances Marion Crawford, that created Daisy Chanler, the tiny glimpse that Edith Wharton got as a child for a few years in Rome, a bit that Henry James got on his travels. It was still there. They could still breathe it and walk it. And all of this impressed Russell Kirk. He could sense all of this in Crawford. In true Kirk style, he picked up a lot of Crawford's books at library sales. His friend the judge was selling a collection of books. One of his buddies went into business with an old bookshop and tried to sell the collection, bits and pieces. He discovered, a collection of Crawford's books at an old house in Scotland. It's very romantic, very Kirk. And it's Kirk who writes that, this is really high praise. F. Marion Crawford, as much as anyone, showed me the manner in which history should be written. It's a powerful endorsement. And Crawford's ghost stories, his uncanny tales, they were held in very high esteem in Kirk's, what he called his Gothic mind. He wrote in a letter that one of his own ghost stories was partly inspired by Crawford's works, partly inspired by some of that brickwork and stonework that Crawford did at his own house. And so Kirk writes that for over nearly half a century, I courted the company of the shade of Marion Crawford, and I lay claim only to being, in some degree, his unworthy romantic disciple. In writing the book, digging in a bit to Crawford, I found that the last time Notre Dame's great philosopher, maybe some folks even on the call knew Ralph McInerney. The last time he saw Russell Kirk, he told him how delighted he was to discover that he loved Marion Crawford too. They had a nice chat about that. And then, as I discovered partly through writing the book, one day in 1978, Kirk was delighted and amazed to receive a letter postmarked from some place called Saracinesca House. It was named for Marion Crawford's trilogy about an Italian family with the same name. This Saracinesca House wasn't located in Italy. It was in Nashville, Tennessee. There was a delightful man. He probably would have gotten along well with everyone on this call. He was named John C. Moran. He had somehow divined in all of Kirk's writing but what he had never acknowledged was an appreciation for Crawford, and he invited Kirk to write an introduction to a book he had coming out on the author. And as I was writing this book, and the piece on Crawford got released through the New Criterion, I was contacted by John's sister. She was delighted to learn that someone still had an interest in Crawford. I was delighted to learn about this man, who for many years, I think as Cecilia's confirmed, there's a stack of correspondence between Kirk and John Moran. And so I learned a bit about this guy. He had a BA in English, a master's in library science, spent most of his career at Peabody College, which is at Vanderbilt. And with loving devotion, he kept this flame of Marion Crawford lit throughout the second half of the 20th century. All the works had gone out of print. You know, he went from full collection being reprinted, outselling Henry James, to mostly forgotten. And he published this was a real labor of love, a 600-page compendium of Crawford's works. He directed something called the Marion Crawford Society. They held a delightful annual conference in Sorrento. He published an annual literary journal called The Romancist. He typeset it manually. And then by himself, he published a series of monographs that was in the line of Crawford and his friends. John was an interesting guy, I came to discover. He was a Latin Mass Catholic, and like Marion Crawford, he had investigated and concluded that all the world's philosophies and the occasionally reliable results of modern science would lead to mental and spiritual chaos. To have peace of mind, he thought one must abide by the church. Moran would declare with a wink that his motto as a historian was non serviam, John or Gerald can translate, and he refused to serve the false gods of the academic establishment. He rejected political correctness. He received a Fulbright scholarship in 1977 without applying. He declined it. He didn't like Fulbright's politics. And the passion to right the wrongs of the other historians, it took him to Honduras. He gave up his tenured position and went to build a library in Honduras and stayed to run it. While he was there, you know, he was a crusader. He worked to rescue a bunch of Central American figures from unfair Black legends that had been told about them by the victors in Central American politics. For his work in Nicaragua, he's the only non-Nicaraguan in their National Historical Society. He had a photographic memory. He spoke Latin and Spanish fluently. He was a kind mentor to young historians, including a woman named Patricia Hageman, who wrote a definitive biography of Crawford under John's guidance. And after a sudden diagnosis of pancreatic cancer, he passed away in 2016. His only regret was that he ran out of time to write more books. And John Moran and his hero, Francis Marion Crawford, they died on April 9th, separated by 107 years to the exact date. Crawford died with a rosary in his hand. He was attended by a Capuchin friar. Crawford's last words were, "I enter serenely into eternity." And John Moran, with a priest in black vestments, was remembered at a Latin Requiem Mass. It was the first Latin Mass in Nashville in 50 years, which Moran, Crawford, Kirk, it just provoked in me, you know, three questions. Why does a priest wear black vestments? Why did John Moran love Marion Crawford's uncanny tales? Why did Russell Kirk write ghost stories? Well, Kirk wasn't shy of telling us what he thought. So Kirk would tell us, well, mainly I wrote them in the hope of discomforting an old man on a winter's night, or a girl in the bloom of her youth, not to summon spirits from beyond, but he wrote them to conjure up in you, me, all of us here, a dreadful joy, like that of a small boy on a stair. A secret stare, I think he said. And in this season of Advent, Cardinal Newman would remind us of the first lesson of mingled humility and joyfulness. That was taught by a strange, uncanny messenger from the other world. "Fear not," said the angel, "for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy. Shall be to all people." Russell Kirk, most folks on the call know this, he wrote from Piety Hill in Michigan. He saw that John Moran was performing a very pious act by renewing our knowledge of Marion Crawford. Kirk observed, "We seem to be entering upon an age of mystery and trial. Out of renewed perceptions and chastening experiences may come a fresh search for the wondrous. My little humble hope that this book, this may be a quick answer, but not a complete answer to Kirk's call for a fresh search for the wondrous and delightful, especially delightful people. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That was really wonderful. And I think gives a very clear sense of really to borrow from the title, the delight of this book, because not only does it show isolated, or it doesn't show isolated academic style literary history, but really shows a chain of personalities and relationships and what they're trying to do with their work, and how beauty and mystery and the uncanny really affect these individuals and is reflected in their work. Really just wonderful stuff. And I hope that it does inspire those of you who don't have their copy, will go out and get one for yourself or others.
Get a box.
So we do have a couple of questions that have come in, and first, a question from some folks on the call that they want the creation story. Stephen, what led you to this group of people, right? This particular network, and what, if anything, might be next?
Great question. Two great questions. In the beginning was Willa Cather did not want her books assigned in schools. She hated that idea, loathed it, hated it, tried to write it into her will, screamed at her publishers, tried to stop this. And in that way, I was lucky. I wasn't assigned them. I didn't pick them up before I was ready. I had Death Comes for the Archbishop on my reading list for 5 years and just never got to it. Picked it up on the train, had all this time commuting on the train, picked it up, loved it. And then noticed we had moved out from New York City. We moved out from Brooklyn, Gerald's wonderful Brooklyn, to Connecticut, and noticed that there was a little boarding house, which is now the local historical society. And if you come from New York, or frankly, even if you're from Boston, or you're from the Hudson Valley, you think of Fairfield County as this nothing place. In some ways, that's true. The county itself is meaningless. Connecticut doesn't have county government, it's only towns. The towns are what they are. Pull up old history books. Greenwich, Connecticut was once a charming, expansive town that flowed from the sea to the horse country. And when you move out, now you think it's mostly hedge funds, which is not entirely incorrect. And the thing that also spoiled some of a part of Greenwich called Cos Cob, which was once a seaside village. The highway destroyed that. So 95 ran through and wrecked that. There was an old water mill, and there was an artist colony there. There were a series of artist colonies that dotted the eastern seaboard. One of them was Cos Cob. Probably the most famous impressionist was Charles Hassan, whose wonderful paintings of American flags on Fifth Avenue are very special. Well, he would come out here and he would stay, and there were a bunch of muckrakers from this old magazine called McClure's Magazine who would come out and stay here on the weekends. The timetable's the same, the train schedule's the same. It got faster for a little while until a conductor fell asleep, and now Gerald and I have to travel at 19th century train speeds into Manhattan to prevent that. And so I started poking around this little artist colony, and through McClure's Magazine, I realized that Willa Cather would come out and stay there. And so that was partly inspiration. Well, what brought her out there? It was this wonderful editor, Viola Roseborough. Charles Hassan had actually painted Cather lounging on the porch on a couch that is supposedly now owned by Oprah Winfrey. I don't know if she had a particular connection to Cather, but I'm sure she'll take good care of it for all of us one day. And just started pulling on that. The Historical Society had some information. Frankly, these are a great resource. I don't know if anyone's ever contacted their local town historical society, county historical society. We would pull it up when we were looking at houses, show us the We have a taste for old houses. Show us the oldest photo you have of this house. We have a photo from our old rental house that shows a big kind of Studebaker with big fenders out front, parked there. We have a photo of our house right now where there was once an apple grove, and we cry every time we look at that. Where did our apple trees go? So it was just pulling on that. The woman who brought her out here is a very unusual person, Miss Viola Roseborough. And the act of figuring out who she was an adventure in and of itself. There's one biography written about her. It's great because it references a lot of things that are now lost in the archives, but it's enough that you can verify some things about her life. But the woman who wrote the biography was very strange. There was a character in Roseborough's life with the same name as the biographer. And for some strange reason, the biographer intentionally obscures throughout the book whether she is that person. She sort of wants you to believe that she somehow overlapped in Roseborough's life. So there's some sort of strange things going on there. And then the difficulty on some of that is Cather recalled all of her letters as she was getting old in age. So the collection of letters that you can read, and you should get it. It's a great selection of Cather's letters. It's highly readable, well edited and arranged, but it was published against her will. So most of them are destroyed, and with that, a lot of her correspondence with Roseborough. So that pulled on that. But from there, it was one thing led to another. It was understanding, okay, who did Cather know? From Cather, it went to Roseborough. From the two of them to Sarah Orne Jewett. From them on to the artist they admired, and we're off to the races. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
I have the great luxury, unlike academics on the call, I don't have to footnote. I don't have to note. I get to write essays. It's a superior form of output. You get to just enjoy and luxuriate in your projects. It's not work for me. I have all the advantages of the amateur. I don't have to do all that stuff. I get to pick about what I want to write. I'm fortunate to have a day job. Gerald, I'm sure you appreciate that some days. It's hard to make a living as a writer. Those of you who do it have my never-ending admiration. So I have all those advantages. So that's why it makes it fun. When I moved to the suburbs, I also discovered, for men except for Gerald, you pick up hobbies when you move to the suburbs, and all my friends were picking up golf, or fly fishing, or hunting, or woodworking. I had no interest in any of that. I had played football in college. I had no interest in playing more sports. I thought, why don't I go hunt and fish for some delightful people? That'll be a fun way to pass the time. So that's it.
Well, that leads to the next question, which is really a combination of two questions, which is this concept of a delightful person, right? So just as not being an academic, you don't have to write in an academic way, not being a literary person, and that is in the literary industry, you can develop, and I'm putting words in your mouth, so you can correct me. You can develop your own delightful people, and how does that look like to you, both in terms of what you see around you, in terms of the culture, as well as obviously in the restrained conditions we have now? I know that you and your wife were making significant efforts to cultivate some delightful people in circles, but what does that look like today based on your experience? I mean, to me, it seems a lot of literary industry types are simply in another kind of business and aren't as delightful as one would like to think. But there are some questions along those lines asking for your take on that.
What a lot of these characters did was they made a masterpiece of their private lives, independent of some of them playing significant public roles in American history. Many of them were just masters of conversation. Art and music came easy to them. Even in letters, the spoken word this was an important ritual or source of entertainment. There's a an anecdote, I think from Daisy Chandler's early adulthood. The whole family would gather at the crumbling old estate in the Hudson Valley, and they would start a novel together early in the morning, start reading it aloud to each other, break, go to Sunday services, come back, pick it up over lunch, and get to the end of the book by the end of the day. It was something they could do together. They enjoyed it. And there was also, I think, a sense that their conversation was really sparkling. They really did have a gift for that. And wit, making the other person delight in their time with you, not being a bore. In some cases, heated arguments. I mean, some of the things they would argue about was serious literature. They had serious debates. And there was a richness and a depth to the culture that also came naturally to them. It wasn't an affectation. Mm-hmm. Some of this was they had incredible leisure. Some of these characters are quite affluent. It's before the income tax. There's certainly some inherited wealth. But there's also a sense of where do we want to invest our scarce time? It's the scarcest thing we all have. What do we want to invest it in? On the train, Gerald, I don't know if you ever noticed this, I started to become very concerned with grown men playing video games on their I understand a college student going back to college, while away at the time. Grown men, though, sitting on the train day after day, settling in, doing nothing with their time. There was a little self-help book I read just for amusement. It's about 100 years old. It's called How to Live in 24 Hours a Day. This was before the 4-hour work week and all these life hack things. And the simple message of the book was you have a commute, man, businessman, working man. Why don't you use your brain during that commute instead of doing nothing, amusing yourself? So it's a sense that time is the scarcest thing we have. How can you use it well? Time was never wasted with these people. They had a lot of parties, they traveled.
Right.
But it was a sense that their days were full. And it was full of people around them. And I think the sense that also the arts were a unity for a lot of these characters. And it was very natural to seek out the connections between the two. They weren't, arts appreciation for them was not an academic discipline. In some cases, you could argue they kind of got the academic or the real interpretation wrong. Cather wrote Death Comes for the Archbishop and Shadows on the Rock after seeing an anti-clerical painting. This artist Vibert, who writes these wonderful paintings, has these wonderful paintings of cardinals lounging and eating lobster, kicking up their feet on the couch. And there's a painting that she saw, and it was a missionary, dusty, dirty, grubby missionary returning from the New World. And he's, talking to a bunch of French cardinals who don't really care about him. They're not even listening. They're half asleep on the couch.
Right.
She took it the totally opposite way. She just said, how wonderful. Look what this guy came back from. What did he just see? And she said in a whole flash, the whole novel appeared to her. She had had experiences in the American Southwest. She had the raw material in her brain.
Right.
She hadn't thought about writing it until she saw that flash of inspiration. So there's something of that that I don't know that we can fully recover today.
Yeah, I think that's right. That there's a large backdrop of cultural assumptions and presuppositions that inform all of those people. And I've been spending a lot of time reading the novels of Louis Auchincloss, who's one of the last sort of lawyer writers, and he comes from that culture, and you could see that world dissolving, where the parents and grandparents are much more like Cather in terms of expecting some kind of both profitable use of your leisure time as well as not being a bore in company. And you see that slipping away as he writes about the following generations.
Auchincloss met Daisy Chandler. She was pretty old. I think she was in her 90s.
Really?
He met her And she said, why don't you pick one of Henry James's books and read it to me? Quietly listening through the ear horn.
Yeah.
Stops him. No, I think you got that verb wrong. Go back, read it again. So
that's great.
Even I think he knew, he could sense there was something in being with her. He was reaching back. He was touching Henry Adams.
Right.
He was touching the 12th century through these people. There was a sense that for some of these folks, you weren't just touching American history. You weren't just talking the 18th century through the Adams clan. You were reaching back even further than that through these people.
Right.
There's a depth to the history you could reach through them.
Yeah, I think that's right. There are a couple more questions. For those of you who may not have been here as we started, if you hit the chat button for more and want to ask a question, go ahead and type it in, and I will see it and rewrite it and read it out to folks. One question that's come in really is looking at those essays. Many, if not all, of your figures do have this connection with Rome, and that this Rome has this impact on them. And I'm curious as to whether you can synthesize what that might be. Is it the contrast between the young Puritan type American civilization with the deep Roman civilization? Is it something else that they find attractive? Because not only do all of your or most of your figures go there, there are multiple groups of expats that go there over many decades, and wanted to get your sense of how you read that reaction.
There's the classic Henry James issue, which is he just thinks Europe is culture. Europe is the source of all that's refined. Americans are brash. Walker Percy answered that one time, I think. He said, well, the cathedrals weren't ripped up out of the ground by cafe sitters. The cathedrals were pulled out of the dirt of Normandy by ambitious, brash, aggressive men who wanted to get stuff done, who spent the whole of the treasury to build these monuments to their lady and to their god. Cather's an interesting one. I think Chanler, Daisy felt this tension. She really did grow up in Rome, so it was she felt Roman. So even when she came back to America, she missed Rome in the sense that we all miss our home. Cather is a trickier one. She loved the Renaissance popes. She loved the power and the glory of that. There was a strength and a confidence to that era, a sense that people could get things done beautifully, that you could change the world. And Gerald, you've been a part of various conversations on the political right in America. There was this debate a couple of years ago. It was Kevin Williamson or something said, well, what do you tell people who are in a place that's dying? Go move. Responses back to that. Well, that's a heartless thing to say. There's also a third piece, which is what Cather comes across in the pioneers. There is this sense in America that you can set out. The frontier is still open. And I think even in parts of America, that's still true. We have challenges, but there is a place where you can set out and start things fresh, do things new. And Cather, at least in her best fiction, she's not shy about explaining how difficult all of that is. There's no romanticism about how difficult starting a farm out of the dry dirt of Nebraska is. But it's a sense that, goodness gracious, you can go do that here. And so there's something in that, and you get that with some of her appreciation for the missionaries. It's a sense that the missionaries have to launch from the center. They launch out from the center out to the peripheries. But Francis still talks about this. Go from the center to the periphery. And from Rome, Cather feels like something was launched that's still in motion. The ships are still sailing from there. It's still influencing us. Art, culture, and I think even religious faith for her. Cather was not Catholic, but there was a sense that she was comforted by the fact that Rome still existed. The Roman Church still existed and existed as it was. It was stable and sturdy. She didn't want to be a member, but she needed it. Her brother died suddenly. He was 50 or so. And she didn't go to St. Thomas on Fifth Avenue. She went to St. Vincent Ferrer, served by Father Austin's Dominican friars, same place Andy Warhol would sit in the back pew, hear Mass. And she would sit there in the dark, cry, mourn, pray. She would say how special it is, how unique it is that the Catholics have this place for us to go at any hour of the day. We want to be alone with our grief, be alone with our Lord. So there's something real that they all perceived in it. All of them became members. Some of them resisted it. Winthrop Chanler, his wife would, I think, probably pestered him to convert. He just said, no, hold off here. When my head's that far off the ground at the end, then I'll call a priest and convert. It basically happened that way. He was right, and he was brought in. I don't know if it answers your question, but
no, it does. It does. It's very helpful. Let's see what else. So someone asks you a very pointed question, Stephen, which is, did you have, in writing this book or these essays, a specific literary model or models, not just authors general, but were you trying to model yourself after someone's style, or did it just derive out of what you had read and then was reflected in the way you wrote?
I'm not a good enough writer to create something out of nothing. I'm not good enough to write a novel. So a lot of this is piecemeal. And I think that's part of the fun of the book, is I hope it introduces you to a bunch of people in the same way that when you meet someone, you delight in their friendship, you want to get to know the rest of them, the rest of the people around them. I think that's just how friendship works. And so a lot of the book is, I hope, a generous introduction to the actual words of a lot of the people here. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, each chapter or each essay or pen portrait, I hope, is inspired by just the person and their personality. In some cases, they actually had literary output. Try to mimic some of that. The people I love are often essayists. Most folks here probably read Joseph Epstein's essays. He has a great, I think, summary of what he does. He takes a line out for a walk. And so that's a lot of what I'm trying to do. Something catches my eye. And I think, well, why don't I build a piece around that? Excuse.
Got it. Great. And I think that we have time for one more question. Josh, I think you had risen your hand. You want to take yourself off mute and go ahead?
Thank you, Gerald, and thank you, Stephen, for the book, for the wonderful the presentation. What can I say but that it's delightful. You've obviously done a ton of research and worked very hard. You wear your learning lightly, and the book is a reflection of that. And as you say, you're happy to be an amateur and not be constrained by certain expectations of some sort of artificial community of what a book is supposed to look like. My question is something you've kind of answered implicitly in what you've talked about already and your answers to other questions. But I'm wondering what it says that we can find these people delightful in the way that we do. If I try to describe what it is that you're writing about, right? I mean, first of all, I know tons of people, perfectly good people who might not take delight in the same things that I do, right? We're a kind of exclusive club here tonight. But so what? There's this haphazard group of late 19th, early 20th century people, Americans, people connected to Europe. They visited Italy. They're Catholic, or they're fellow travelers. They're writers. They're artists. They had enough money to have leisure. What is it about that that lifestyle, that time period, that culture that we today in the early 21st century want to connect to, that we apparently feel close enough to it that they're ours, but they're far enough away from it that we need to recover it? I don't, I'm just trying to put my finger on why this seems so important to understand this this culture that you've identified.
What I hope is these people are received as a gift. They were a gift to the friends around them, and we who have the benefit, sometimes their published works, sometimes the gift of their memoirs. There was a sense that these folks intended some of this to last beyond them. A lot of the sources, Josh, you were kind to praise the work I did. A lot of the sources are private memoirs. Even the great autobiography, The Education of Henry Adams, was privately printed at first. He'd share it around. These were things meant for his friends to treasure. Even Mont Saint Michel and Chartres was privately printed and shared with a few friends before it became a smash hit. You know, folks said, this is really special. You should share this with some folks. So in some ways, I'm just trying to preserve something that doesn't deserve to be lost. These people made a gift of themselves to their friends in conversation or in the printed word or in art. And other folks can stumble on that gift and preserve it and appreciate it and be grateful for it in the same way. I think there's also, in the act of writing the book, it's a creative act. The act of creation many of these characters went through is reflective of the divine intelligence that's behind the universe. I mean, a lot of this does, even the ones who are not explicitly a religious story, it points to a maker and a creator. They were able to create something in their lives, and I don't think that deserves to die. And we're lucky that librarians and archivists have retained some of their letters, some of their privately printed works. In some cases, I was able to contact the descendants. I spoke to a descendant, Dr. Beatrice La Farge, descendant of the artist. She's in Frankfurt. She's an academic. Her mother passed away a few towns away from me in New Canaan. She shared a lot of La Farge family lore. That should keep going. A lot of that's not sitting in a library.
Can I mention something very briefly, by the way?
Please, yes.
So you talked about the youngest son who became a priest.
John, yeah.
John Jr. Father La Farge. Very influential. He started you probably know this, started a school in Baltimore for African American boys, was an editor at America Magazine, and also wrote the first draft essentially as a ghostwriter of an encyclical never published on racism.
That's right.
And it wasn't published because it was the late 30s in Germany, and the Pope was being very careful about how he dealt with diplomatic matters. But the archives of Pius, is it the Pius the 11th? I think, I forget which Pope it is. Were opened in the spring, right before the pandemic, and there was all kinds of expectation. There were scholars lined up to go research the archives, and there's great expectation that we'll discover more about what was decided and conversations about that encyclical. And I haven't heard very much because I think that a lot of stuff in Italy was shut down. But I don't know if you've thought about going to Rome and looking at the archives and looking at La Farge's son's papers that might be there.
Josh, why don't you get the Mount to sponsor a little academic junket over and do some work?
The two of us will go together.
Your research assistant, that would be really fun. The of it is also a lot of these characters and their histories. It's a pretzel. They overlap and fold in on themselves. So just on La Farge, yeah, Father La Farge, very interesting character. There's a grandson who went over with what we know now through the movie and the book, the Monuments Men, the group that went over to Western Europe to protect the art that had been seized by the Nazis. And so Bancel La Farge goes over. So this is the guy whose grandfather traveled with Henry Adams from Mont Saint Michel to Chartres later in the 20th century, he himself is going over to rescue the very same works of art. He makes the same journey that his forefather did when he lands in France and manages the recovery of the great treasures of Western. So these things just fold in on themselves constantly. Some of these were distinguished families, established as close as we had to established families in America, and so that's natural. But there is a sense that these folks just can't escape some sort of destiny that a lot of them have been assigned. Mm-hmm. I just find that endlessly charming and delightful.
As do I. So Stephen, I lied. I have two more questions for you. Sure. And then I'm gonna combine, and they're not exactly the same, but I want to get them both out there so you can have a couple minutes to answer. So the first one is directed more at your practice, which is based on the reading of these authors. I think I know, based on what you said before, what your answer might be. But based on these authors, how has your assessment of how you should allocate your time changed, if at all, looking at these folks? And then the second question has to do with the phrase you use in the book, which is a Catholic sense of time. What might that mean, or mean to the people who about whom you're writing?
How would I use my time? Well, one, I just like doing this, and I want to keep doing this. And I'm sure, Gerald, that was your experience when you started doing all this stuff, whenever that was. There's a sense that I delight in the act of finding more about these people. I confess I have written about a few delightful places, so we'll see if we can franchise this with Cluny Media. Maybe we'll tackle delightful places one day. But there is a sense that all these little gems are waiting to be picked up on the ground. You just have to bend over and pick them up, put them in your pocket, and carry them with you. So I think for me, it just confirms I like doing this. It's fun. It's enjoyable. Hopefully that's obvious from people who read the book, that it's a book to write. I don't know if it's of interest to anyone in our family. We got married and lived in a studio apartment, which is a very wise thing to do, to sign a 2-year lease in a studio when you're newly married, and then 9 months later you have a newborn, and you're all sharing a single room. Because of that, we've never owned a TV. So our family life and our home revolves around books and music and art on the walls. And I have a beautiful, highly extroverted Australian wife. And so we have a lot of parties. Don't tell the COVID authorities, but we do like it. And so we want to do more of that. These people had a lot of parties. That was very obvious to me. There was a lot of champagne. There was a lot of parties. There was a lot of music. And I think that's the good life.
Right.
You have a party and go to church the next day. Sounds pretty good.
Right.
It's not complicated. I don't know. Lots of, I'm not going to sell as many books as the Benedict option, but I don't know if we need it to be complicated.
I think that's right.
What was the second question, Gerald?
The second question was your use of the phrase "the Catholic sense of time" in the book, and what might that mean either to you or might have meant to the people about whom you write.
For me, and I think it was actually John La Farge who told it to Viola Roseborough. She had come down from the mountaintops of Tennessee and made it to the big city, and she tried a lot of different things. Tried to make it as an actress, tried to make it as a writer, found her way as an editor, was in the middle of the Washington Square Gang in New York, that whole society set. She was not married, ever married. And you had a sense that she was sort of a free radical, just bouncing around, wasn't sure of her place in the world. She knew she had discovered this genius, this master, Willa Cather. And a lot of her work to get Cather stuff published is an act of piety or adoration for what Cather was capable of doing. The sense that my life's work will be to make this woman, Willa Cather, known to the whole world. But at the time in New York, there were a lot of different ideas. I mean, even, this comes up in Crawford's life. Occultism is a sort of faddish thing. La Farge himself is very influenced by Japanese culture. There's lots of things mixing around. thank goodness. Henry Adams certainly lamented changes in technology and the pace of life. There was a sort of frenetic pace to life that people were experiencing. So as things were modernizing, right? There was a sense that things were in flux that were taken for granted as stable 40 years prior. And so La Farge tries to temper Roseborough's enthusiasms. That's the great Ronald Knox book, talking about enthusiasms. So he tries to slow her down. There are ideas that have been considered. We have, as my introducer, Father Austin. They're still working on Aquinas. You can stay a long time with Thomism. You don't have to chase after intellectual fads. There's plenty of fertile ground where you can follow a master along and stay along with that. So there's some of that for me, but there's just a lot of intellectual ground that you can cover and recover, partly through the wisdom of the church, which is a storehouse for a lot of this, a seedbed. It contains the code that we need to use in the future. So that's what I just returned to. It's no surprise, a lot of the pieces, almost all the pieces, circle back in the end. Most of them close on some sort of reflection on faith, the God who made us, and the destiny that we hopefully all can achieve one day, if the hope we have is true. So hopefully that makes sense.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. And I think that with that, I've run through everybody's question. So unless anyone has something that I don't see, Stephen, I want to thank you again for coming here and talking to us about these delightful people, and to everyone who joined us. The Bookman and the Kirk Center and our co-hosts are very grateful for your participation. And so go out and grab that book and let us know what you think. So Cecilia, is there anything else we need to close on? All good? All right. Stephen, thanks very much.
Thank you all.
Enjoy the rest of your Advent.
Very kind of you to spend time with me. I'm not that delightful, but